The views and content expressed on the Pop Culture Courtroom are provided solely for educational and entertainment purposes and do not constitute legal advice. For any legal matters, please consult with a licensed attorney.
Welcome to the Pop Culture Courtroom. I'm Matt Hardin.
And I'm William Mayfield, and today we are talking about Harry Potter and the Chamber of Secrets.
Now, before we get going, if you haven't read the Harry Potter books or seen these movies yet, we really can't help you with that. You really should have, and if you haven't, go check them out soon. But there will be many, many spoilers throughout this podcast today.
Today we're going to talk about 3 incidents. The first one is going to be Harry and Ron being unable to get to school the way they normally are through platform 9 3/4. The second one is going to be when Harry is hit with a rogue bludger and Professor Lockhart tries to heal him. Not very effectively, as we'll figure out. And then number 3 is going to be a theme throughout the whole book in that the Chamber of Secrets gets opened, yet school goes on at Hogwarts.
Well, I thought a good way to get us in the mood for this today is Katie, our marketing person at our office, kindly gave me some butterbeer jelly beans for Christmas, and so we're going to try them out.
Are these different flavor beans? You know, because I know sometimes you could get, was it a bogey favored one?
With the every flavor beans?
Yes.
No, those are not these. These are actually the butterbeer ones, and they frankly taste pretty similar to the drink you can get at Universal at the Harry Potter World there. That's the cream soda with, you know, kind of a butterscotch sauce on the top of it. They're really tasty.
It was really good, especially the frozen version. We went in January one year, and it was extremely cold, but I still got it. And I was probably good on sugar for the next 2 or 3 months, but it was really good.
So Chamber of Secrets is the second movie in the Harry Potter series. Book 1, The Sorcerer's Stone, is more of a setup for the series as I see it. The world building, you know, J.K. Rowling creates this wondrous world that we all love so much. Book 2, we really start seeing a lot of things happen. We see a much more active attempt to bring Voldemort back.
The tone is starting to shift a touch darker than the first one. Of course, the ending of the first book was a little bit darker, but the theme of most of it was introducing us to the magical world, like you said. And now that we know about the magical world, we can kind of really dive in. So our first incident is obviously towards the beginning of the book. Harry and Ron are trying to get back to school as normal. They try to race through the brick column at platform 9 3/4, and they're unable to do it. And so usually they'd be able to go right through. Interesting to me that the Muggles don't ever look at people running through a brick column, but when they smashed against the brick column, all the Muggles turned and wondered what they were doing. But that's beside the point. The main point is they were unable to get through, and they never got on the train to go to Hogwarts.
Well, there's a lot of interesting things going on in this part of it. The twins, Fred and George, and Ron had rescued Harry from the Dursleys with the flying car, you know, this Ford Anglia that plays a big role in this movie. And Ron and Harry's decision, well, we can't wait 3 minutes to see if Mr. and Mrs. Weasley come back out after everybody else has gone on the train. Nope, something wrong. We've got to get in this car and we've got to fly there.
Right. You and I talk about this quite a bit. As great as J.K. Rowling is, there are lots of plot devices in her books. And this was one. There were so many better solutions to this problem than doing what they did. However, they're young kids, and they probably wanted an excuse to drive that car anyway. Now they've got one, and they can look at the adults and be like, what else did you expect us to do? Kind of ask for forgiveness, not for permission type thing.
Yeah, and as somebody who has a 10 and 12-year-old, and even my 6-year-old at home, they often try to press boundaries and do things and then ask forgiveness later and try to figure out if it's something they can get away with, because they're all really eager to try to grow up, sometimes maybe a little faster than they should.
So, knowing that kids are that way, they're generally not going to be to blame, but who is to blame? And I'll put out a few possibilities. To me, something that stood out about this was, I believe in the first book, that they do a little bit of a head count on the train to see who's there, to make sure that everybody's there. Well,
kind of the Kevin McAllister Home Alone plot point.
Exactly, and we all know my opinion on that. In this it's at least not their kids, and they have more kids to account for. The assumption from the teachers at Hogwarts might be that if they miss the train, they're at least with their parents or something like that. But I do think there is some blame on Hogwarts, because that train left without Harry and Ron, and given Harry's level of fame, that is a pretty big oversight that Harry Potter is not on your train.
It is, but there's almost always barely any adults on this train. I mean, what we have is the woman that hands out the sweets and the trading cards and so forth, and then whatever random new Defense Against the Dark Arts teacher is planning to take over for that year is on there, and then it's prefix. You know, it's other kids ratting out other kids that are in trouble. So William and I have spent a lot of time talking about the different modes of transportation in this series. You know, you have the apparition, where you have to get a license. You can't do it till you're 17, and it seems to have limited distances. To my knowledge, the only creatures that can apparate in and out of Hogwarts are house elves. You have the port keys, which don't come up, I believe, until the fourth book, when they're going to the Quidditch World Cup.
It's a big theme in the fourth book, obviously.
On top of that, we have the flu network, which actually happens in this book. That's how they get from the Weasley house to Diagon Alley. However, they also have the car there for Harry and Ron to be taking off and stealing at the end of this.
The kids end up taking this flying car to Hogwarts, and there's a bunch of dramatic stuff. I mean, in the movie, they've got Harry hanging on the edge, and he like lifts himself up, and they finally get to the school, and they're consumed by this tree called the Whomping Willow.
They essentially crash into the Whomping Willow.
That's alive and like engulfs the car. And I remember when they get there, Snape says something that, you know, you were seen by X amount of muggles. So that was a big issue, that they were seen. Arthur Weasley, who owned the car, loved muggle studies. I think this car was really intended as more of a toy, and we're not going to go into it, but it'd be interesting to see the laws in regards to not letting muggles figure out your magical character.
The limits on the distances is explained to some degree in these books. Supposedly the apparition, the farther you can go, the more powerful wizard you are. But, you know, there's a scene later in the books when Voldemort is coming to Hogwarts where he's having to fly most of the distances. You know, Harry, when Dumbledore is injured in the cave when they were getting the locket, Harry's able to teleport or apparate them what appears to be hundreds of miles. Hogwarts does not appear to be nearly that far from the King's Cross station to get to. So there's half a dozen other ways that Harry and Ron could have gotten there. I mean, there's bound to be Flu Network going into Hogsmeade, which is right by there. There's bound to be port keys going in there, and you know, the Flu Network is the one that makes the most sense. They fireplace to fireplace, and then they're where they're supposed to be. That much trouble. They don't even have a conversation with their parents. They just truck on.
I always found it very odd. So Hogwarts is obviously a central location. They all seem to go from King's Cross Station to Hogwarts, but it's a boarding school. So why do they all live close to King's Cross Station? Wouldn't some of them live closer to Hogwarts than they do to King's Cross Station? So there's clearly some stuff where we've got to use our imagination a little bit, but we could go on about that forever. We're going to kind of get down to the nitty gritty of this incident.
So what are the damages here? Well, you could argue that there's emotional damages on I believe around 6 muggles that saw the flying car, but I think there's lots of things in these books which suggest that muggles go out of their way not to believe magic or come up with other reasons for things, and probably a very simple light obliviate spell could take care of that issue. They do crash the vehicle into the Whomping Willow. Do we remember why the Whomping Willow is there at Hogwarts?
I don't.
All right, so the Whomping Willow was planted during the time that James Potter, Sirius Black, Remus Lupin, and Peter Pettigrew were friends there. Lupin is a werewolf, and they built essentially a bedroom inside the Whomping Willow, and then also a pathway to get to the Shrieking Shack in Hogsmeade, where Lupin could transform into a werewolf and he'd be safe. So this is a long time from there. I mean, it's 30 years or more later at this point. Not really sure, why do you have this violent tree that can harm and potentially kill people that's still at the school all this time later when there's no other werewolves there?
And presumably the tree has grown and even gotten more dangerous. You know, as far as damages go, I don't think the school is going to have much of a claim for the Whomping Willow's damages because, like you said, and it's really a hazard that it's even there in the first place. So what damage? Honestly, it probably benefits the school if the tree was cut down to begin with, unless it's like some precious artifact or precious historical thing, which it's really not, at least to our knowledge.
Well, and if it's a normal tree, I mean, if it gets a gash in it, there's treatments you can give it. It's mainly where the bark is exposing the inner parts of the wood of the tree that causes potential problems. And I mean, the Whomping Willow is there the rest of the series, so seems like it's good to go.
Yeah. So Harry and Ron make it to school unscathed, so they don't have a claim for any sort of damages. The biggest claim to damages might be the damage to the vehicle, but guess what? That vehicle belongs to Arthur Weasley, and I think although you could potentially blame Dobby for shutting down the pathway for the kids to get through the column to get to the train, really the person most responsible for damaging that car, at least 50% or more, which is what our threshold is in Tennessee for recovery, is Ron, his son. And he's not going to sue his son.
Well, I mean, like you said earlier, the biggest potential damage was Harry nearly plummets out the side of the car. Your boy Ron didn't even try to go lower just in case. He just keeps on going next to the train. Maybe if Harry's about to fall off, you take that flying car down close to the ground and he's going to be a lot less likely to be injured.
I never knew when I was reading the series and watching these movies how much of a Ron apologist I was going to have to be before I met you. You know, Ron is the friendly sidekick. Everybody needs a friendly sidekick. I mean, what would Ricky Bobby be without Kyle Naughton Jr.?
Well, Kyle Naughton Jr., played by John C. Reilly, is every bit an equal actor to Will Ferrell. Ron Weasley makes the actress that plays Hermione look like she's Meryl Streep. Just watch one of these movies, especially the first couple of movies, and just look at the expressions on this rubber man's face. I mean, it's always a bit of a struggle when they have the level of actors they have in this movie, that they're the adult actors versus what the kids are. As adults, I've seen Daniel Radcliffe in many things. I've seen Hermione in even more things. You know, she's had a successful career. What's your favorite post-Harry Potter Ron movie? What Rupert Grint, I believe, is his name.
Rupert, I apologize. I set that up. I knew where it was going. It was inevitable. There was no way that anything other than that was about to happen. I apologize. I think you're great. Well, one of the best keeper in the history of Gryffindor that I've ever seen.
Wow.
You queued up a second Rupert Grint rant here?
Nope. Okay. We're going straight Ron rant. So Ron, the character, is set up in order to give Harry a connection to a wizarding family. He had missed out in his own family due to, Voldemort murdering his parents. So this gives him a surrogate family other than his Hogwarts surrogate family, both of which are very important in, Harry becoming and growing up to be a happy person. Ron has so few high quality characteristics, in the first few books, other than I think he's really good at wizard chess. And to his credit, he's typically willing to go along with the escapades that Harry's taking him on to save the world against Voldemort and have good prevail over evil. Other than that, what is Ron contributing in this particular story?
I'm glad you asked. And before I answer, in the legal world, the order in which you do things is really important. Who goes first? Who goes last? Plaintiffs, defendants, what strategies you take. So I'm going to be the defendant here and go ahead and try to take the last word on this and go straight into case or no case.
That's an attempt to cut me off, but I can promise you I'm happy to respond to whatever nonsense you're about to hear.
And we'll see if our Judge Katie will allow him to respond. But Ron's main purpose, of which he does a very good job, is that he is very familiar with the wizarding world. And so when we come upon this, and I'll use chess like you talked about, Harry goes, "What's that?" He goes, "That's wizard's chess." And he explains how to play wizard's chess, and then they get those are Bertie Bott's every flavor beans, and that's more Australian than English, but and he explains things to the audience, which is actually really necessary in the movies because they're taking lots of material and bogging it down into a very small movie. So I think that is a great use of Ron. He does a really good job with that. Now jumping into case or no case.
No, wait a minute. So let's point out to our listening and viewing audience that counselor for the defense here has given 0 in this book that Ron has done to contribute to the success of defeating Voldemort. And essentially in the big scene that ends this, where Harry goes and faces the basilisk by himself, Ron conveniently, they have a bunch of rocks and stuff that fall down, and so Ron can't even participate in the heroic part where Harry saves the all the children at Hogwarts yet again.
We wouldn't even be here if he hadn't won that game of wizarding chess in book 1 to get Harry to the next scene so that he could deal with Professor Quirrell / Voldemort. Ron has purpose. How you value him is up to you. Obviously, Matt values him 0. But you, the viewer, may value him differently. And it's just something we're going to have to agree or disagree on and move on. So case or no case?
So let's point out before we move on, just before the goes out to jury, so to speak, there's nothing in the legal world where one person gets to talk about new things and then the other side doesn't get to respond to it. Let's point out, I don't think Ron is 0. I think Ron is another one of these plot devices we talk about. And I believe the author agrees with that because later on in the series, she starts ratcheting up and giving him, merit badges and things he's good at. He somehow becomes a prefect besides never really accomplishing anything up until that point, past book 1 wizard chess. And, she ends up putting him on the Quidditch team much later. So we can move on to this next part as far as whether the case.
He's doing my strategy.
So what Counselor's strategy is, beloved
You
audience.
just did what I did.
Beloved audience, is if you cannot win the argument you're making, you attempt to change the argument to something else. So while this particular podcast is about book number 2, Chamber of Secrets, Counsel for the Defense has only talked about something Ron did at the end of book 1, which is not the subject of today's lesson. So go ahead. What do you think, case or no case?
And people wonder why cases go on for years sometimes. I don't think the damages are really very significant at all, except for to the vehicle, which is, we learn later, is still operable. And because of who caused the harm to that vehicle, I don't think anyone's going to recover anything for this. It's not a case for me.
Well, we don't know whether or not there's wizard car insurance or not. I don't know how many people are driving cars. There's a suggestion in the book that Arthur Weasley's not even supposed to have this vehicle. I doubt he paid anything of much for it. The car's still there. It's still a magic car that seems to have become capable of thinking for itself, which is pretty amazing. So
AI.
I believe that ultimately Arthur Weasley has no interest in getting this vehicle back at this point and reminding his wife Molly that he hid something from her and that her boys went out and drove this thing multiple times without permission.
And I would also say that in lots of car insurance contracts, they contract around different things. I don't know if this car was intended to be a flying car.
And not a flying car that 12-year-olds could drive.
Absolutely not. Absolutely not. So moving on, we are going to talk about the second incident. Just like in the first incident, Dobby is trying to keep Harry Potter away from Hogwarts, which he believes is unsafe for Harry. Keeping him away from the school by not letting him get on the train didn't work. So now he has cursed a bludger to specifically attack Harry Potter. And those of you who are big Harry Potter fans know bludgers fly around and they don't target one player more than another player. The beaters can hit those bludgers and try to direct them at players, but they are not programmed to target one specific player more than another player. This one was, and Harry got hurt as a result. In the movie, they have this big duel for the snitch, but this bludger, and they're flying around dramatically, and they do that to show that this bludger is moving in a very unnatural way to go after Harry. And while Harry does an admirable job of trying to avoid the bludger, essentially what I got from the scene was no one would have been able to avoid that bludger.
Well, Madam Hooch is supposed to be overseeing these contests, and this would never happen, but is there any intervention from anybody at Hogwarts because of this rogue bludger?
I remember Hagrid getting up and saying, "That's a rogue bludger." And it's finally destroyed by someone. I can't remember who it was.
That's Hermione.
Hermione.
She comes out and does a spell and blows it up. But the answer is there is no intervention whatsoever actually to take a time out or to do something about this. I don't understand. They're never willing to stop these matches for any reason, no matter what's going on, whether there's Dementors wandering out on the field or someone's trying to kill Harry while he's 100 feet above the ground with no safety mechanisms.
Whether or not falling from a high distance is is risky in this world or not is never answered to me. Sometimes like they'll be falling and then like some magical force will stop them from hitting the ground, and then sometimes they'll hit the ground and be really injured, and it just seems like more of a yes or no to me. But regardless, Harry is hurt here, and to the rescue comes Gilderoy Lockhart.
Harry's arm actually gets broken by the bludger right before he catches the golden snitch to win the match for Gryffindor. And Gilderoy Lockhart is already being shown at this point in the book and the movie as being a giant fraud. Somebody that's almost what they call a squib, and somebody that's not very good at magic, even though he's a wizard.
Yeah, and I remember he tries to fix it, and instead of fixing the bones, he just gets rid of all the bones in Harry's arm, and he goes, "Oh well, that can happen," which is pretty typical of Gilderoy, just not accepting any responsibility and keeping up this facade. Unlike in an earlier injury that we discussed in a previous podcast, though, this led to a night of significant pain for Harry.
Right. So we have a couple of things going on here. One, who's allowed to practice medicine in this world? I mean, you've got Madame Pomfrey, who essentially heals most things. Gilderoy Lockhart is shown as being incompetent at teaching defense against the dark arts. He's incompetent at even the most basic magic. He comes in and tries to practice wizard medicine on Harry without a license. So we don't really know whether or not in the wizard world, whether medical malpractice is a type of claim. But typically you would expect, I think, as a general negligence case, for someone to be properly trained and be able to execute the healing spell that they're doing before they do it. So Gilderoy Lockhart's shown as being this famous author who's sold lots of books by, stealing the ideas of wizards and witches that are his betters.
Where this really falls into a pretty simple analysis for me is but for causation. And what that means is, would this have happened but for the actions of one particular party? Essentially trying to decide if Gilderoy Lockhart was the cause of Harry's pain.
He can also be what's called an intervening or superseding cause, which means there can be more than one cause to injury or damages in a negligence case. So you could start off, a good example of that would be you're in a car wreck, your arm gets broken, but then you go to the hospital and a doctor does not set the arm correctly when they're putting a cast on or when they're doing a surgery, and that leads to a secondary injury. Well, you're going to likely be able to hold both those parties accountable for what those injuries and damages are, and if there's a lawsuit, they probably both get sued. In this particular case, you talked about in our first Harry Potter podcast when Neville Longbottom fell off the broom during flying lessons, that his pain was only a few minutes, maybe 5 or 10 minutes until his broken wrist was healed by Madame Pomfrey, and then he's good to go. Here, the first thing Madame Pomfrey tells Harry when he gets there is essentially, "Why did you let Gilderoy Lockhart do this? I could heal broken bones in seconds. This, we got to give you Skelegro." It's got kind of this cool bottle with a skeleton on it. This is going to be painful. It's going to take all night, and it's going to hurt you.
Right, and you brought up a great point about the intervening cause. That's really helpful. You look at the original cause of this. It's Dobby cursing the bludger. Well, it's pretty well documented that Dobby doesn't have any assets. So I don't know what you're going to get. You can sue Dobby, and it can be determined that Dobby was negligent or the cause of this. But good luck, because he doesn't have anything. So when Gilderoy Lockhart becomes an intervening cause here, well, I mean, that could be Gilderoy himself. That could be the school for hiring Gilderoy and not doing a sufficient enough background test on him. This fraud that he's represented is not really well known to the world, obviously, because his books are being sold. But maybe a normal background check would have given some red flags. Maybe he shouldn't have been hired. Clearly, in hindsight, that's the conclusion. But bringing Gilderoy Lockhart and potentially Hogwarts into the claim actually allows Harry to potentially have a source to where he could recover from.
Well, in the school scout, there's multiple avenues to get at the school. In this particular case, they set up Quidditch, which is this fun sport for these kids to play without taking really even the bare minimum of safety precautions. It wouldn't be that hard to have, several of the teachers who are all highly powerful wizards be at the ready with their wands on the side of the field. If someone's falling from the sky, to use whatever spell you use to make sure the Bouncify or whatever so you don't hit the ground at full speed. Dumbledore at one point in the series actually slows Harry down later on when the Dementors come on there to keep him from hitting the ground as hard. So, I mean, there's certainly things the school could have done to make Quidditch a safer sport, kind of in the lines that, if you play tackle football without equipment on, you're a lot more likely to get hurt. So the wizard equivalent of that is to maybe take a few precautions so you don't kill your underage students. So you have Lockhart come in here, takes the bones out. Harry has a very painful night. He's woken up with pain. He hears the basilisk, I think, at the same time saying he wants to kill everybody, the snake, because Harry speaks Parseltongue, and that's why he can hear and understand what the snake is doing. So you've got basically a whole night of excruciating pain while he regrows the 33 bones in his arm. So, I mean, there's some recovery there. And then on top of that, it's not just the physical injuries. You can have an emotional injury, and that in particular, as this series goes on and on, I mean, the toll, I mean, Harry's early life, his parents are murdered in front of him. He goes to live with the Dursleys, who are atrocious, family members who don't take care of him. So he's got some real damage growing up. And then he goes to Hogwarts and makes these good relationships. But the school itself, are they particularly good at taking care of our young wizard?
You said Bouncify. We're both really scared of heights. Don't really like flying. I really wish there was a Bouncify. That would actually make my life a lot better.
Or a parachute to fly, something like that.
Parachutes, nets, that would all be great. Another thing is, Harry Potter is particularly good at catching that right there.
The old golden snitch.
And it might even be a possible profession for him. As we learn, there's professional Quidditch players. And when his bones grow back, do they grow back in a way that he's as good at Quidditch as he was before? Probably. But sometimes injuries have permanent effects. So that's something to consider as well. I think Matt and I are probably in agreement on this. This is definitely a case. And I think that the source of recovery is most likely to be the school. But Lockhart has amassed some riches himself from all of his fraud.
Correct. And I think he probably gets sued in his individual capacity as well because of that, especially what you find out later. But Lockhart later on in this book, something interesting just to throw in here, tries to do a memory charm on Harry and Ron once they really find out he's a fraud, when he's running away scared when they've got to go face the basilisk to get Ginny Weasley out of the Chamber of Secrets. So they find out that he's essentially a coward. And at that point, they use the broken wand of Ron's, which we'll talk about a little bit later. It doesn't work, rebounds on him, and he ends up, we see him later in one of the later books. He's in Mungo's down the hall from, Neville's parents who lost their minds. He never recovers from this.
No.
But he did it to himself. So, I mean, it's ultimately, is it a comp claim for Lockhart? He did this on purpose. He's committing fraud. It's not really in the scope of his job to obliviate somebody else, a child's memory. It's not really clear what they charge for medical treatment in this world. We don't ever hear about magical health insurance. So maybe they figured that out in that world.
Wizard care. He did all of this to himself. And even in a pure comparative fault state, we've talked about modified comparative fault versus pure comparative fault.
What do those mean?
Modified comparative fault means that if you are 50% or more at fault for negligence or something that happens to you, you cannot recover. It's important how that's worded. Lots of cases can be 50-50, right? We don't know what's happening. In a modified comparative fault state, that means that neither party would recover if it was 50-50. In a pure comparative fault state, you could be 80% at fault for what happened to you and still recover the 20% that was someone else's fault.
Still hard to do.
Very hard to do, but in this case, I would state under both standards, Lockhart has no claim for the rebounding spell. He was trying to obliviate the memory of a 12-year-old child. I think
2 of them.
He's lucky to be at St. Mungo's. I think the Dementors should have him at Azkaban.
Well, all while trying to lead Ginny Weasley to her death from the gigantic snake that lives in the Chamber of Secrets. I mean, he's a turkey any way you look at him.
So the third thing that we're going to talk about today, it's not really an incident, it's really a theme of the whole book. The Chamber of Secrets, there's the title, gets opened. Hogwarts has had a history. The Chamber of Secrets has been opened before, and a student who we end up learning later is Moaning Myrtle, who's a ghost in the house, died as a result of the Chamber of Secrets being opened. However, at no point during this entire period where they learned that the Chamber of Secrets opened did Hogwarts close down the school.
it's pretty difficult for them to close down the school. I mean, I believe this is the first time that Dumbledore gets run off, as headmaster, before telling Harry that as long as he's loyal to him, he'll always be there for him. It's not really clear what the relationship between, the Ministry of Magic, which is the government entity here, and Hogwarts is, but they clearly have some oversights. There's a board that Lucius Malfoy is on that's constantly trying to get rid of Dumbledore in service of helping Voldemort get back in power.
Yeah, and it always struck me how big of a part of their world that Hogwarts is. We see that a lot with like if you look at the highest paid public employee in a lot of states, it's very often the football coach for like a state school. So it's,
well, as it should be.
Depending on how many wins you get, but
that is a fair point.
So it's not uncommon for schools to take a really big part in society, but this is at most a high school, and so that's what's unique about it.
This particular story, we know that this chamber was opened approximately 50 years before that, at a time when Hagrid and Tom Riddle, who becomes Voldemort, were students at the school, and Hagrid is actually expelled related to the Moaning Myrtle incident from the school. All she really remembers when she even describes it to Harry and Ron is that she saw two glowing yellow eyes and she died.
You brought up a good point about Hagrid, and I think something that we'll agree on. I think he has as good a case here as anybody.
Well, let's talk about him during irrelevant evidence. I think.
Good point. So we'll skip on that for now. The school is aware of the danger that exists here. Multiple students get petrified. I believe it's Colin Creevey, Hermione, and Ginny Weasley. Correct? Is there any more?
Justin Finch-Fletchley. Ginny Weasley doesn't really get petrified. She just has all her life force taken away from her because Voldemort's trying to take I believe they use the word corporeal form, or basically a human form again.
Incorrect. And I'll actually give them a little bit of a pass on Ginny Weasley because that wasn't really foreseeable. That isn't something that had happened in the past. However, like you said, the chamber was open 50 years ago. They've dealt with this issue before. They know they're dealing with a basilisk. These students are getting petrified. Well,
shoot, a ghost gets petrified.
Right.
Nearly how this next gets petrified. He's already dead.
So if you look into a basilisk's eyes directly, you die. The only reason these kids did not die is because they caught a glimpse of it, whether it's through a mirror or a piece of glass or something like that. So not only did you have a student die from this exact same thing 50 years ago, but you are having students come dangerously close to dying on a weekly basis at this point, and you still haven't chosen to close the school.
The one thing I'll say is they're not 100% sure the chamber was open 50 years ago because they essentially blame Hagrid and the spider for it. So Dumbledore, who's head of the school, I would think knows. He ends up making, Hagrid the gamekeeper of the school at that point after he's kicked out. The problem with that is, and the part that I agree with you with, is we start right off the bat. I mean, it's written in blood on the walls, to beware that the Chamber of Secrets is open in giant letters. The series of the children getting hurt, they're not doing anything except saying, well, the school may get closed if someone dies.
Yeah, they're essentially, so the law uses reason quite a bit. And a reasonable precaution here would have been to shut down the school. If someone, a representative for the school were on the stand, if I were talking to like we talk to corporate representatives oftentimes in depositions, if I had a representative from the school on the stand, I would say, do you believe the students were safer at school or at home during this point? Do you think the logic pointed to them being more safe at school or at home? And I don't think that they could reasonably answer that question by saying at school, given what they had going on. The second part, just like, and we see with dog bite analysis sometimes, right? When a dog has a vicious propensity, some states have the one bite rule, meaning the first time you don't know about it, but after there's been one bite and they bite again, all of a sudden you're on the hook for that now because you knew of their vicious propensity.
Well, in our state, it depends on where the injury is. I mean, if you have a propensity to bite an animal like that, you have to have that if the dog or the animal attacks somebody on the property where it lives. If an animal bites someone outside that property, you're responsible no matter what.
In this case, we have the most aggressive version of that, which is the school has seen this exact scenario before. The school is currently seeing a pretty aggressive version of this.
5 times more aggressive.
Right. The reasons, it stands to reason that if they don't shut down the school, there's a really high likelihood that a young child is going to die. And whatever they were learning that day, whether they were learning to turn rats into slugs or whatever it was, to me, could wait until we get this situation under control. So for me, this one, we hear people frequently call their cases cut and dry. One thing I've learned in this profession is cut and dry is awful hard to have. There's always exceptions. But to me, the students who are petrified, the parents of the students who are petrified, and Harry all have a claim against the school and the people who are in charge of deciding whether the school stays open or not.
Well, one thing we've not talked about too is they're essentially targeting Muggle-borns here. You know, everybody with the exception of Ginny Weasley that is injured or petrified here. You know, Colin Creevey, Justin, and Hermione are all Muggle-borns whose families would have grown up in a place where if your child is put in imminent harm and put into a coma like they are here, they're probably much more likely to be litigious about it. What is not particularly clear is whether Hogwarts School is considered a government school, a quasi-government school, or a private entity that's overseen by the Ministry of Magic Educational. So it's not really clear. So we don't know whether there's a magical government tort liability thing that might limit recovery here that makes the school not worry as much because there's limitations, or it's just in the wizarding world. The justice system in the wizarding world seems to be mostly about criminal justice, not civil justice.
Correct. That's at least what we see. I'm going to make an educated guess on what you just brought about. I, at the very least, think that Hogwarts does not charge for tuition, which would make it more likely to be public. And here's my reason for that. Weasley family is notoriously not super well off financially, and they have like 1 million kids run through this school. So that would add up financially if they were paying significant tuition payments for each of these students.
Here's what argues against that, I think. Every single book, the Weasleys who can magic things out of thin air are highly concerned about buying school supplies, including the textbooks, which to me makes it seem more like a college type situation or a private school situation where they're paying tuition.
But regardless, one thing I think we do agree on here, there is a case, and it's pretty significant.
It definitely is, and this, as the series goes on, there's more and more of this type of thing. The school takes more and more reckless steps, and even harder, worse things are happening to these students as it goes on. So ultimately, I think there's definitely a case against Hogwarts here. You know, I think there's probably a sub case on an incident that we've not even talked about in this one, which is Hagrid getting thrown into Azkaban with no evidence that he did anything whatsoever. You know, it's probably a civil liberties justice case. Innocent until proven guilty doesn't seem to really exist in this world very well. Their criminal justice system, they have Azkaban with Dementors where it's suggested that you go mad after a few weeks being there, but there's no like minimum security prison for somebody to go to while your case is pending. There's nothing mentioned about, you know, Hagrid going through any part of the justice system or in the criminal world, you normally go through a arraignment, a preliminary hearing where they have to put on some type of evidence in order to charge you with the crime. There's no wizard grand jury, like considering the facts. It's just like, well, Hagrid was peripherally involved in that thing we could never prove 50 years ago. Now there's some students being petrified. Hagrid to Azkaban. I mean, that's basically what they do. They seize him and throw him in jail without any type of, investigation at all.
Can you imagine trying to get someone served in this world where they can just dart around and hide themselves with invisibility cloaks? And it's hard to get some people served now. And
there seems to be a lot of unpunished theft in these things as well. I mean, Voldemort steals most of the Horcrux, the stuff he makes into Horcruxes. You've got Mundungus Fletcher, who's peripherally on the good guy side, but he's stealing from Harry, he's stealing from everybody in sight while it's all going on, never punished for it. So, I mean, I don't know. It's the whole Azkaban or nothing thing makes no sense to me.
So the lesson we can take away from our 3 incidents today is while Hogwarts might provide a fantastic vacation for your kid, beware.
If you're sending your kids to Hogwarts after the first couple of years of this, you start realizing this is going to happen every year that they're going to be put in peril, and that Hogwarts isn't going to particularly put a lot of effort into, when you teach very dangerous things, protecting your children from it. But ultimately, it seems to be their education system, and movies and books are still really fun. And then part of it is because they're put in this peril and having to figure the ways out of it.
And they obviously do a lot of good for the magical world. I mean, pretty much every wizard or witch that you hear about in this book went to Hogwarts and learned everything that they applied to their life at Hogwarts. So it's a balance for sure.
Well, there's bound to be some homeschooled wizards too, and there's bound to be wizards that have moved to England from going to other schools like Durmstrang or Beauxbatons, and we don't really hear about that. It's just kind of outside the scope of what this world is. So, well, let's move on to irrelevant evidence. So we talked about a bit about Hagrid 50 years earlier getting his wand broken in half, and then that's juxtaposed with Ron. How does it work out for Ron in this book, trying to work a broken wand for the entire book and movie?
I would argue it works out great for him, because if he'd had an operating wand, he would have had his memory obliterated by Professor Lockhart.
Hagrid is what we want to talk about here a bit. So William and I've had this discussion a few times. It's always bothered me that, we start off learning that Hagrid was expelled from school related to the Chamber of Secrets being open last time. They broke his wand, and we have occasional references to Hagrid using this broken wand to do things, including probably the first one is when he gives Dudley Dursley a pigtail for trying to eat part of Harry's birthday cake in the first book.
Hagrid is a favorite character of many Harry Potter fans. The actor that played him recently passed away, unfortunately, but he has a famous line in the reunion about how he won't always be here, but the legacy of Harry Potter will be. He's a larger-than-life character, and he keeps the books fun, especially as they get a little bit further along in the series and the theme gets a little bit darker and more adult. He's still kind of a constant person that our main protagonists, Harry, Ron, and Hermione, can go back to. However, given his role, it is odd, as you and I have discussed, that he was never given a wand back. He was put in this kind of precarious situation of being a teacher, but without much of a curriculum to go based off. He, to me, continues to suffer for this injustice that happened to him 50 years ago. And while Dumbledore clearly loves Hagrid, Hagrid is never the same from that.
No, and I want some justice for Hagrid here. Nobody does anything to clear his name in this book. It's never even really mentioned. I mean, why does Hagrid's wand seem to work okay when this entire book and movie in the Chamber of Secrets, Ron's wand is a disaster, and it's the same thing, where it's essentially been broken in half. Ron's wand gets broken with the Whomping Willow crash, but Hagrid seems to work just fine. I mean, I'm sure there's theories out there that, the only thing I'm aware of that can repair a wand in this world is the Elder Wand that Dumbledore has later on, where you can actually repair a wand. So it doesn't show it in the books or the movies, but it's arguable maybe he repaired his wand. I think there needs to be justice for Hagrid. They need to clear his name. It would have probably been pretty fun for him to pick up his studies, and I believe he was like a fourth-year student when that happened. Let him sit in on some classes and then see how that goes. They give him this teacher role, which I suppose can be considered a carrot later, where he does the care of magical creatures, but the author decides to make him not very good at that, and which is frustrating. So you're kind of lessening a character that I think, as you're right, is a beloved character in this, and he's another central parent figure to Harry and frankly the other two while they're at Hogwarts. And frankly, from my point, much more arguable he does a lot more for Harry than Dumbledore does.
Now, the one thing I will say, if I were to take a different approach, in the way that personal injury claims are often handled, or really the only way they can be handled, is you assess things that happen to you in your life, and then you receive money damages for whatever that is worth. And oftentimes, money cannot make you whole, no matter how much of it there is. But that's really all that we have. That's really the only way that we can do this. One argument that could be made for Hagrid is that he really is in a spot that he loves. He loves magical creatures and taking care of them. He loves the kids. He loves Dumbledore. And although maybe from the outside world or perspective, Hagrid's life is not this glamorous one that maybe he would have had he gone on to be this, profound student and gotten a really good job or anything like that. He might be exactly where he wants to be. So he may have chosen to not take any action.
Here's the rub on that. This book starts, and I don't think it's in the movie. The book starts when Dobby drops the dessert on the guest at the Dursleys' house, and Harry's essentially sanctioned by the Ministry of Magic for practicing underage wizardry, or they clearly look at whether wizards are doing magic that aren't supposed to be. So Harry, remembers that, and that comes up as a plot point later on, especially when he goes in front of the Wizengamot and they're going to think about expelling him from Hogwarts, that, he already had the citation for something that Dobby had done. Well, Hagrid's they're able to apparently track when wizards do magic. Hagrid can't do magic, or is not supposed to do magic. And so a official, one paragraph that says Hagrid was cleared of this bad citation from 50 years ago, and he's allowed to proceed as a wizard does. I don't think he has to change his occupation for that, but allows him to live a normal wizard life in a community that's going to look down on him for not being able to do magic.
And there's no doubt that he would benefit from that. And oftentimes, I think sometimes people choose not to bring a case because they're worried about the perception or something like that. And that's not really what we do. We try to get people back to where they were before. When they have something happen to them, and you have medical bills that overwhelm you and you miss time from work, those have to be dealt with. Unfortunately, it's just the realities of being part of an injury. And that's what we help people with. That's our main goal is to rehabilitate you and get you back to where you were before. And to your point, Hagrid would have really benefited from someone helping him with that. My point was really more just to say, I think Hagrid is such a content and amiable guy that he just didn't take any action.
I think it's one of those situations where Dumbledore should have helped on that one.
I totally agree with that.
But it's not the first time that Dumbledore, this great wizard, is maybe not focused on the things he needs to be focused on.
And that's one of the redeeming qualities in Dumbledore is, as great as he is, he's not perfect. I don't think she's trying to insinuate that he is. He's human. He's a wizard. He's not a muggle, but he is human, and he makes human decisions. And just like any leaders, might make some mistakes from time to time, but overall, he does care about Harry and Hagrid and tries his best for them.
All in all, a very good book. We've talked about this before. The first 4 books especially are very special, and these next 2 are very, very good as well. So we look forward to do those later in the series. So thank everybody for listening to us today.
And thanks for stopping by.
And you stay classy, Hogwarts.
The Pop Culture Courtroom is a Matt Hardin Law production.
If you've been involved in a car wreck or any other type of personal injury or wrongful death case, check us out at matthardinlaw.com or give us a call at 615-200-1111.